So morning, folks. So yeah, as the slides say, look behind to move retrospective and all. Basic thing, as I sort of imply, I think there's actually a lot of value in looking back at old games and gaming history and using that to sort of move forward. So I really was going to waffle about who I am, but Lena's done it so well. As Lena's a programmer, freelance programmer, so do a lot of, as sort of have this retro channel, like when I do these sort of Let's Plays. I got interested in it really as an excuse to look at design a bit more. It was a period when I was a little stumped on some of my personal projects, and it was a good opportunity to realise that I could sort of work out what these older games I really enjoyed did right, and use that to sort of inform decisions for any future projects I was working on. Now, before we get on, just a quick little exercise. As sort of said, the intro is sort of about this, how we don't really look back at gaming's history and use that to inform it. So just have a quick think about like your favourite movie, favourite book, favourite album, favourite TV show. Are any of them, like, you're not your absolute favourite, but any of the ones you highly regard, do any of them predate you? And for me, that's actually the case with a couple. And that's seen as perfectly legitimate, right? No one looks at you and says, you're a retro movie watcher, or you're a retro novel reader. Yet when it comes to video games, that's the truth. I mean, so that's Star Raiders, released on the Atari home computers in 1979. That's one of my favourite games, and it does actually predate me. I'm what, 33, so I'm born right as the cusp of the microcomputer revolution. So it's really odd that that's the case. You can see, to me, I think there's a history problem with gaming, right? Gaming is a medium that doesn't seem geared to look back at itself to evolve, right? We know that movies, there's a lot of referencing to older movies, and not just in the Hollywood, let's remake everything sense, but in the sense of understanding where that medium comes from. They sort of reflect on it in a very positive way. And there's a few reasons for this. The first of those is commercial development, right? The commercial model of games development means that we have this like technological obsolescence, right? The average console cycle, 5 years long, right? Even though this last gen took a little longer than that, it's roughly 5 years. And when that happens, your previous generation of consoles gets cut off and no longer made for sale. Those games are no longer in print. And if you actually look at the transition from I get the generation numbers wrong, but the transition from the GameCube to the Wii and the original Xbox to the Xbox 360, both of those platforms, hard cut off. Whereas, the PlayStation 2, there were still releases being made on that for quite a few years after the PS3 came out. We also have a retail model that's a problem, because when you go to the stores, and people still do buy games at stores, you might only be able to get a game brand new for only a year or so, because there's this push for trading in. There's this like short cycle where a game comes out and it might only be in print for a short period of time. Then eventually it's just going to be discontinued and gone. And on top of that, we have digital platforms, but with digital platforms, there's also a significant upkeep. Particularly, actually, as much as I love iOS, the App Store has a few problems where you need to continually keep up to date with the evolving mobile hardware. And on top of that, you've got that $100 US per year subscription to the developer program. And if your games are not making that money back, is it worth continuing to pay that? And when that happens, those games disappear off the App Store. If people have the install, the IPA file, which is what you download, they can reinstall them, but otherwise they're gone. But then there's also the narrative of gaming history, right? The conventional wisdom when it comes to games history is you start off with Ralph Baer, rest in peace, and the Magnavox Odyssey. You then move on to the various Pong consoles, eventually the Atari 2600. You get the American crash of 1983, the recovery and the introduction of the NES to the West. You get the battles of the 16-bit battles between the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, the rise of the PlayStation, and the rise of Xbox. But that ignores the rest of the world, right? There is a very significant American narrative there, because in Europe, and to a lesser extent Australia, it was all about home computers, right? You had, a lot more of I guess you call a little homebrew, like the original indie scene being people working in their bedrooms by themselves, all close friends to create games. And how the games industry grew in Europe was significantly different from how it grew in America and in Japan. But there's also the aspect of preservation, right? Media, magnetic media, optical media, cartridges, they have a finite life. We have already seen, and I have games in my own collection that I have difficulties loading, those cassettes and floppy disks. Cartridges, we don't know how long it's going to be before the ROM chips fail on those. So preservation projects are important. But at the same time, it's not just the software or the hardware, but also the culture, what people were thinking about when they wrote those games, or what people were talking about in terms of, playing those games. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do what I do with my channel. But there's also things like MMORPGs. Those games have a heavy server component, and when that server gets shut down, it's all gone. People's stories, and if people aren't sitting there screen capping those, it's gone forever. But there's also the academic side of it. There are a lot of academic programs, but part of those programs, especially in the US, have had funding cuts because, and I hate to say the word, but fucking Gamergate. And I apologize for the F-bomb. But fucking Gamergate's attitudes are causing the people behind these programs to wonder whether it's worth the hassle. And that saddens me a lot. On top of that, there's also the Entertainment Software Association in the United States. They've basically come out and said in the last week or so that modifying, cracking, or patching software so you can continue to run it for an active preservation is basically piracy. And that is scary, right? So why should we care? It's just old games, right? But the fact of the matter is, when you look at film, in the US, I was reading an article that talked about how 50% of the early American cinema is gone forever. Gone. Because people didn't focus about recovering it. There's always the stories of, like, for example, Doctor Who, how so much of those early episodes are gone because they just wiped the tapes because they didn't think it was important, right? You may not think it's important then, but we will think if it's important down the line. And if anyone in the room went to the Freeplay 10 on Thursday night, there was an excellent discussion about a game called Genesis, which, even though it was a game that won an Australian Game Developers Conference Award in 2005, there's nothing about it online. Like, just maybe some scant descriptions about the game. Like, because the developers never finished and released the game, they used to have a trailer on their website because it was before YouTube. And so it's just gone. So we don't know about this game, even though it was a winner of a prestigious award. So what can we learn from this? We know that there's a lot of incomplete things out there. We know that, but as designers, developers, as people who are interested in the culture, there's a lot we can learn in terms of, basically, so when it comes to the gaming culture, the fact of the matter is we do need to improve it. I think we have to acknowledge that there are a lot of problems in that culture from that past, and we need to be able to move forward and sort of know why that's the case and how we can do that. There is a lot of terrible, the example I always think of when I wrote this was advertising. I remember some shocking advertising in the 90s when they, in the worst of the pandering to that mythological gamer audience, right? We need to be aware of that so we don't repeat those mistakes. But again, as I sort of touched on earlier, the idea of development across the world, right? Primarily, how things differ between the US, Europe, and Japan, right? Everyone talks about the video game crash of 1983. That only happened in the US because of the glut of terrible Atari 2600 games, right? There was also a faster shift from individuals and small teams to companies writing games. You had the likes of Electronic Arts forming, and when EA was started as, a means of believing in the medium and the artistic nature, if you've ever seen those original album covers they have, I actually have some photos I can show later if you want, those are amazing, where it's like, there's photographs of the developers involved, yet nowadays, EA is just, people who work at EA are anonymous, And again, it used to be, a lot of home computer stuff. You had the Atari 2600, but then you moved to their home, the Atari computer systems, the Apple II, the C64. But then eventually you focused on, your DOS PCs, and a lot more console things happened when the NES came about in '86 or so. But you look at Europe, and in Europe, there was the big home computer revolution, particularly in the United Kingdom because of the BBC's computer literacy program. And the other thing, of course, was that in Europe, a lot of games were on cassette tape. A lot of that was because of the pricing. Disk drives are more expensive and cartridges were more expensive. So the cassette was the cheap medium to put games on. And so, you'd pay a few pounds or, Deutschmark or other European country, because it's pre-European Union, for like cheap budget games on cassette. And I think that's where a lot of programming talent devised and grew and worked on to create those small games. That's like Codemasters. That's how they started. They wrote games for another label, then they founded Codemasters, and Codemasters became a fairly big developer and publisher. And those are, it was like I said, it's the home computers, the C64, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the BBC Micro. Systems like that were ruled the roost. The consoles really only didn't get popular in Europe until the age of the Mega Drive and the Super NES. And of course, Japan was very insular. Whereas in Europe, there were machines from America and in Europe, and America was very America as well, but they still brought some stuff over. Japan was very Japan. There were systems like the MSX computer, an attempt at a standard, and of course the rise of the consoles there. But Japan corporatized sort of fairly early compared to the West, which was very interesting. And and just the way the culture formed there was very different. It's something I've definitely not had as much exposure to, so I can't really talk about it as well. But then let's look at games themselves. And we have things like mechanics, right? Some of the mechanics of games that were popular in games back then are gone. That's probably a good thing, because there are some they're wrong, but some have come back. We've seen roguelikes come back in a very big way in the last few years. They seem really good for independent teams to work on. But so let's go for one example, is the shoot 'em up or the shmup. I love that term for it. I know some people can't stand it. I love it. So that was the kind of game that was really popular in arcades and on home system during the 1980s. It's a fairly simple action game. You control a ship or a character, you blast your way through, and it's a test of dexterity and memory. And there was, such as R-Type we see here. In fact, this is the iOS port that came out a few years ago. You can sort of see the buttons there. So it plays surprisingly well for an iOS game. But, they were tough games, but they were challenging, but you could learn them and you could do okay. But in the 1990s, you had the shift to what they call bullet hell shooters. And those are games where your ship you'd have to navigate these just beautiful geometric patterns of bullet sprites. But the fact of the matter is they became an even tougher dexterity test, and the difficulty was turned up so high that you really didn't quite understand how to play. They became a lot more, a higher barrier to entry compared to other games. So they sort of became much more niche as a result. Then we look at the evolution of other games, and we have adventure games. And adventure games, of course, started off as your text adventures by the likes of Infocom, where a lot of it was like understanding the parser. You wanted to do something. How did you get the parser to recognize you wanted to do that? So those meant that games were, they were challenging because you had to understand the systems, not necessarily understand the puzzles. But, then we get Maniac Mansion from Lucasfilm Games, Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick. And that's where they wrote the scum system that you could interact with, by clicking verbs and objects in the scene. That led to the point and click games of the late 80s, early 90s. And then, of course, eventually the adventure games died out. And they came back with, more interactive fiction. The Twine Revolution is a great example of that. And, another example, open world games, right? Everyone thinks Grand Theft Auto 3 in particular is like the first example of those. And it's like, no, believe it or not, that came out in the 1980s with a game called Mercenary, which it's not the best screenshot, but you're a mercenary and you crash land, you're flying home after a mission and it opens and your ship malfunctions and you crash land on this planet called Targ. And what happens is you have a bit of money, and your task is to basically get off the planet. You do missions for people, you earn money, you eventually can get money to buy a ship, or you can, this game is open-ended, and it's written in 1985, so for the C64 and Atari's home computers, by one guy by the name of Paul Wokes, and it was written for 48K of RAM. Could you imagine, such a complex world in 48K of RAM? It's amazing. But then there's also the difficulty, you know. You think of like Super Meat Boy or I Want to Be the Guy, those games that, I think the term they use is masocore. Not quite the fan of that, but you know, those games where the high difficulty is a challenge. And honestly, the best example I can think of is the works of a guy named Rafael Checo, who was a developer based in the UK, wrote primarily for the Spectrum. Unfortunately, I'm using the screens of the C64 conversions of his games, and this is Exelon. And you're that soldier, you can sort of see him, the white guy in the thing on the right, the teleporter. The basic idea is you just walk through these flick screen like rooms and you just shoot anything that moves. But it's a very tough game. The difficulty is really intense because when you've got to manage, like you've got limited ammo, and he's not very agile. So you've got to be like really careful in how you move so that you can still blast the things that come through. It's a very tough and challenging game. And, it's sort of, to me, it's like the early style of that frustration. And his entire catalogue of games, when he was working on them in the late 80s, was very much in that style. He's a developer whose works I want to throw my joystick across the room at. But what we can do is we can use that to think of mechanics that were lost and reuse them forward. One of my favourite examples is this game called Paradroid, in which you are basically controlling a droid exploring a series of space raiders trying to quell like robots that have gone renegade. And one of the things you can do, you can shoot the droids, but you can also try to take them over in this sub-game. It's like you hold the button down, you ram into a droid, and you have this puzzle sub-game where you've got 100 seconds to try and light up as most of those little yellow and purple squares in the center. And by doing that, you take over the droid, you've got their upgraded abilities, and that might include weapons, better shielding, and things like that. And another game that's similar is a game called Morpheus, which is not really talked about much. It's a game that was very heavily hyped in publications at the time and didn't do so well because people didn't really understand it. But the basic concept is you build that spaceship. That's actually the first tier of it, but you can get bigger spaceship, add modules. But these modules and weapons become less effective over time because as the game ticks through its internal clock, the enemies become more resistant to your weapons. And it's not like a binary thing like you would see in an RPG. It's just your weapons do less damage because they're evolving, they're getting smarter, they actually get smarter, and they try to be a little more devious in how they attack you. And it just, for a limited 8-bit microcomputer, it's amazing. And there's just so many more. Another example I wish I talked about properly was a game called Deus Ex Machina from a company called Automata. And actually, the original designer of that chap by the name of Mal Croucher actually worked to create a brand new version of that fairly recently. And that's like an interactive art narrative game that did some amazing things as well. But I don't really have enough exposure to it, so I can't really talk about it. But where does that lead us? And really, what that leads us to is actually playing games. This is something that gets a bit of a legal minefield because things like the ESA, about to say NSA, oops. But you have things like the Internet Archive, right? If you've seen the work they've been doing, they have a whole bunch of games that you can play on your browser. Archiving, being able to play those games, you don't have to fiddle with setting up your own emulators. You don't have to fiddle about with finding the hardware. And it's just, sometimes, even like old Atari 2600 games, you can learn from in that way. But of course, Steam and GOG, good old games, are also, getting versions of old DOS, even Amiga games in the case of Steam, pardon me, are also getting games that you can buy for a few dollars and check out. I like the fact that this stuff is still available. And of course, as I showed with R-Type, that screen earlier, the App Store for iOS, Google Play for Android, and I'm sure the Windows Phone Store might be the same. They're getting there are emulator packages there that are legit with properly licensed games, and of course, semi-modernized remakes. They're all out there. And of course, there are things like documentaries, there are other books. Documentary-wise, one of my absolute favorites is From Bedrooms to Billions that came out fairly late